This sample problem goes over how to calculate the gross pay for a tipped employee. Anita receives tips from customers as a standard component of her weekly pay. She is paid $2.50 per hour by her employer and receives $284 in tips during the most recent 46-hour work week. So we need to calculate the gross pay of Anita. And gross pay we know is regular wage plus overtime wage. In this case, it's 6 hours, plus any other types of wages such as bonus, commission. In this case, it's tips. First, let's lay out the information. As always, we do that, and here it is. The rate of $2.50 per hour, tips of $284, and she worked 46 hours. To calculate gross pay, we know that we must take the regular wage plus overtime wage plus tip wages. In any of these type of tipped wage type of problems, we need to calculate the tipped credit. The tip credit, we take the minimum wage, which is $7.25, minus the regular wage of $2.50, and that gets us the tip credit of $4.75. The tip credit, that is utilized by the employer who, because of tips, do not have to pay the minimum wage, could pay a regular wage that is less than the minimum wage. In this case, the regular wage of $2.50, and that is less than the minimum wage of $7.25. And so this difference of $4.75 is the tip credit. It's the credit that's being utilized by the employer. They do not have to pay this balance or this amount due to the fact that the employee are getting tips. So this tip credit, $4.75, very important. Keep track of that. Next, regular wages. Regular wages, $2.50 per hour, that's the regular rate, times 40 hours. So that comes out to $100 in regular wages. So we have the first component of gross pay. Next, overtime wage. Not any additional premium like how we did method 2 in a previous video. Here it's the overtime wage, just straightforward. What is the overtime wage? And to get that, we first get the overtime rate. And the overtime rate, to get that, it's the minimum wage of $7.25 per hour times 1.5, and then minus the tip credit of $4.75. Again, the overtime rate is typically 1.5 times the regular rate. And here the regular rate is $2.50. But that's below the minimum wage. So we use the minimum wage times 1.5, and then we subtract the tip credit. The tip credit of $4.75. So this credit is the amount that the employer is getting, meaning that the employer is not having to pay this out because the employer is paying $2.50 per hour, which is less than the minimum wage. However, the minimum wage is the standard, but in this case, if the employer is paying less than the minimum wage, then that means they are utilizing what's called the tip credit. And here the tip credit was calculated to be $4.75. So again, to calculate the overtime rate, you take the minimum wage rate, $7.25 times 1.5, then take out the tip credit, $4.75, you get $6.13. So after getting the overtime rate, now you want to get the overtime wage, and you use the overtime rate of $6.13 that you just calculated times 6 hours of overtime. That gets you $36.78. Next is the tips. So that's given in the problem. How much is that? $284. At this point, you have completed all the components for gross pay for this problem. And the gross pay is regular wage plus overtime wage plus tip wage. And sum all of those items up, you get $420.78. That's made up of regular wages, $100 from 40 hours worked times $2.50 per hour. Then the overtime wage, which is $36.78. You calculate that by taking the overtime rate times the 6 hours of overtime. And what's complicated here is getting the overtime rate. And to get the overtime rate, you need to utilize the tip credit. And the overtime rate is 1.5 times the minimum wage rate, then take out or minus the tip credit to get the overtime rate. Once you get the overtime rate, you know to multiply by 6 hours of overtime to get the overtime wage. Then you add in the tips given directly in the problem, $284. So these three items sum up to $420.78. Now, for this type of problem, one last step is you must do a check. This check is to ensure that the employer's tip credit is sufficient. So the employer is getting this tip credit. So they are paying less than the minimum wage. But are the tips sufficiently enough to cover being less than the minimum wage? And so that's why we need to do this check. And this check, look at the tip, which is $284. It's given in the problem. It must be more than the tip credit. And the tip credit, you calculate it by taking $4.75 per hour. That's the tip credit per hour. And recall how that was calculated? The minimum wage, $7.25, minus the regular wage of $2.50. So that's $4.75. And then $4.75 times the total number of hours worked, 46 hours, that comes out to $218.50, which is the tip credit, and it's less than the amount of tips. In other words, the tips of $284 is sufficient or more than enough to cover the tip credit that the employer is getting. Now, if the employee's total hourly wage does not exceed the applicable minimum wage, the employer must compensate the employee for the difference. Okay? So, in other words, if the tips of $284 is not sufficient, or like let's say if it was $200 in tips, that is less than the tip credit amount of $218.50. Then the employer must make up for the difference, must compensate the employee for the difference.